Welcome to episode 8 of the Acknowledge to Action podcast. I am your host, Matthew Benko. In this episode titled Stay Capable, we delve into a fascinating conversation with Tyler, who shares his journey of navigating both a career in the Army National Guard and Reserves alongside civilian life. Tyler's insights shed light on the importance of proactivity and staying capable to seize opportunities that resonate with your mission. Throughout our discussion, Tyler underscores the power of networking and how it can serve as a gateway to new experiences and career paths. His narrative emphasizes the significance of acknowledging personal goals and taking actionable steps towards achieving them, all while remaining open to new challenges and maintaining adaptability. Tyler's experiences, including his involvement during Hurricane Katrina, highlight the dynamic nature of the National Guard and Reserves. We explore the diverse opportunities and flexibilities these branches offer, showcasing their unique perspectives and skill sets. Join us as we discover the stories of those who serve in non-traditional military career paths and discover the wealth of opportunities available within the National Guard and Reserves. Tune in to gain valuable insights on proactivity, networking, and staying capable in pursuit of your goals. Thank you for tuning in to the Acknowledge to Action podcast, where we embrace the journey. Tyler, I'm really excited. I'm really thankful for you being here today on the Acknowledge to Action podcast. We have a lot to talk about. I know we're going to have a great conversation, so welcome. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Let's go.
Cool. Well, hey, Tyler, we connected last week. We got a little bit of a rapport, so it was really cool just to, get an idea. And, I heard you first on episode 3 of the Harder, Not Smarter podcast. And not only is that podcast off to a great start, but one of the, I was walking my dog. I was going for a walk, and I heard you featured in that. And when you highlighted and you talked about your National Guard career, that really got the hair on the back of my neck standing up, because I'm in the Air National Guard, and your story is really cool. So I reached out to you, and the rest is history, and here you are. So I'm really excited to hear that part more of your journey there and all the other things, what you're doing on LinkedIn. I mean, you were voted the security's biggest LinkedIn disruptor. I'm curious to see what that is too. So, but yeah, I just wanted to say that, and it's really cool to have you here, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, me too. I think that there are a lot of times that, there are certain MOSs within the military and certain career fields that kind of get a lot more press, right? And on the podcast and on the books and in the movies and all of those other things. And, kind of focusing on our nation's elite in a lot of cases. And it's very much earned and deserved. And I share that admiration for those, folks who sacrifice the most as well. And at the same time, I know, having served in combat arms roles and in the Army and then in the National Guard, and then also split time between like paramilitary, private military work, while also being in a dual status as a National Guard soldier, I came to recognize that there's a lot of other folks out there that do serve or did serve that maybe didn't fall into some of those career fields that are quite as known within like the social media public. But there's a lot of really cool, capable people out there that have kind of taken some non-traditional career paths or tracks, even within the military. And so my hope is that I'm able to highlight some of that for other folks too, and say, these 4 or 5 things that we tend to talk about a lot as representative of the military and service are great. And at the same time, there are hundreds of other stories and career fields and MOSs and job duties and all of these different things that don't get highlighted quite enough. So I'm here simply to kind of show that, there are some alternative paths here and some really interesting stories. And I think that we should embrace and highlight those stories as well. So, whether you were a Delta operator and you were on the nation's, most critical missions, or you're a guy making sure that, the trucks keep running so they're ready to go out on mission. It's like everyone plays a role in this community. And so I think it's important to just highlight those stories. So hopefully we're able to, do a little bit of that today and kind of give some perspective to other folks like us who, served within the National Guard or served within the reserve, within the different components of the military, and what service looks like for us and how we're contributing to that team effort.
Yeah. No, absolutely. What a way to kind of highlight that, because the Guard and the reserves, arguably over the last 20 years, was such a critical part of that. And I'm not saying it's an oversight or an undersight in general, but I think generally speaking, a lot of individuals, even in the military, even active duty, don't understand. Therefore, they can't appreciate some of the things that a Guard, National Guard, and a reservist does. Because here you did that, and we're going to peel back the layers of that a little bit, in addition to all the other things and how you balance. I mean, because the focus point today is like striking a balance. Like, what is that? I know balance could be a buzzword in a lot of different contexts, but it really is like striking a balance and navigating those dual lives. It's a heck of a thing. So yeah, this is great, because your perspective is just going to highlight such a very good perspective on that, and how somebody who's just maybe starting off their National Guard Reserve career could see like, wow, I didn't know that, or hey, I could put these tools in my toolbox to kind of balance that out, or forecast that, set those goals and manage that. So how'd you get started off? Like, so did you start off active duty? Did you go into the Guard? Like, didn't you just, if you could just start off how you started and how you ended up in the Guard, and, just kind of take us from there.
Yeah, so I did start off on active duty. So I signed up for the delayed entry program. So, the recruiter got his quota for me before I graduated from high school. So I got a little bit of that credit, those few points towards retirement from, the winter of, of my senior year up until I graduated. So I was in the Army, I think 5 days after I graduated from high school. So I was in like one of those cycles that's always tough for the recruiters to fill, one that's like right after high school graduation, because everybody wants to have the summer off and go on their senior trips and all of this other stuff. And in my case, I think my recruiter was pretty motivated to say, all right, we got to get you there. Here's your ship date, all of this and that. So, I ended up doing that. So, I was in the Army like literally right after I graduated from high school, and I ended up branching engineers. So I started my career as a heavy equipment operator, and it was kind of funny how it started. I knew that there were jobs in the Army, but I didn't really think a whole lot about it. And so, and my recruiter did a nice job, by the way. So I'm not going to say, oh, a recruiter lied to me or anything like that. My recruiter set me up pretty well as far as like the GI Bill benefits to maximize what I get and all of that. So, I'm fortunate that I don't have that story that a lot of other people have, maybe, or at least they say they have, that my recruiter lied to me or whatever. I mean, I felt like, my experience during like the recruitment process was pretty above board, to be quite honest with you. But he's like, well, what do you want to do in the Army? I said, well, I don't know. It's like, well, what is there? And he said, well, what do you do now? And, I was rural farm kid from North Dakota. So, we go out and we hunt and we fish and we go four-wheeling, and I work on the, the family farm, and we drive tractors and trucks and all that other stuff. He's like, well, I think you'd be a great engineer. You can continue to do this. And when you get out as a civilian, you'll have all these skills and you'll go right into the trades and all that other stuff, which ended up not necessarily happening that way. But so again, I branched heavy equipment operator, went to basic training in Fort Leonard Wood, and then I was off to my first active duty station in Fort Polk, Louisiana. And I think it's actually since changed names, along with a lot of of other installations in the military. I don't know what it's called. I've been out of the loop and retired for a little while, but so I thought, well, I'm going to go to a construction battalion. We're going to learn to build stuff. I'm going to build roads. We're going to do all these great things. I ended up going to a sapper company within an Armored Cavalry Regiment. So I was in a rapid deployable unit. It was kind of an experimental unit at the time, even before strikers had come into the Army. So it's basically unarmored Humvees that had like tow missiles. And it was the primary focus of the unit was like tank killing and then also like high-speed mechanized reconnaissance. So essentially I was a part of a reconnaissance regiment. And within the equipment section of a sapper company in this regiment, it was kind of equivalent of like being in a weapons platoon of an infantry company. So like a specialty platoon. And so it's a lot of going along, digging in armor, mobility, counter mobility, survivability. So I found myself, just as a consequence of how I got assigned when I went into the Army and got to my first active duty station, that it was very much more tactically focused than like the construction side of the engineering world. And then I ended up just kind of staying there through, I don't know if the career branch managed me that way or what happened, but so I did that. And I ended up spending the last year of my active duty assignment on the Korean border. So again, you can go to Korea. There are a lot of places around South Korea where you can be stationed. And I ended up in Area 1. So I think I was in a post that's now since closed, but I think we were 6 miles off the Korean border, like 10 clicks. And so again, it was in an equipment company that it wasn't really about construction work, right? It was about mobility, counter mobility, survivability, breaching minefields, all that type of stuff. And then also, if the horn went up to deploy to the borders, digging in armor and making sure that armor had freedom of movement. And likewise, if we encountered enemy emplacements, those types of things in a real world scenario, it would have been like a demining function. And then engineers, of course, once they do the engineer thing, they're already in the environment. So I like to say that engineers and combat engineers in particular are essentially like a combination of an infantryman and EOD soldiers, right? Because they have all the demo and they have all of that capability. And I think that that's kind of, one of those things too, like we talked about in the beginning. It's like there are all these other cool MOSs that I don't think get talked about enough. And it's not that they're not good or fulfilling or anything. I think in some cases it's people like me who are actually in it need to tell our story about how cool our branch or how cool our regiment was and all the work that we did. And so whatever your MOS, I think that's where that falls in line as well. And so I finished up a tour on the Korean border. And then, like a lot of folks, I separated from active duty, but stayed in the Guard. So re-enlisted into the National Guard as a way to kind of continue service and go to school. So I did 4 years of active duty and then National Guard after that. And then subsequently the reserves all the way up until retirement. But, for all intents and purposes, I like to say that for about the first 9 years of my military career, even though it was a combination of active duty into the National Guard and eventually the reserves, for all intents and purposes, the first 9 years was my full-time job between deployments, training, etc.
Okay. So, you did a standard enlistment right out of high school. And how many years was that again? I missed that last part.
Yeah. 4 years of active duty. And then I transitioned into the National Guard and, throughout the years had some other re-enlistments. Like I think they were all about 6-year enlistments, right up. And I might've done a couple of extensions, negotiating some things, and then eventually I ended up on an indefinite until I retired.
Okay, so you did. Okay, so how did you find the Guard? Like, what was it? Something planned? Was it like how did? So as you were coming to the end of your 4-year enlistment with the Army active duty, how did you find the Guard, and what prompted you to make that decision and make that transition?
So, for me, I did some research at the time, and I wanted to go to school, and I realized that the state that I'd been on active duty on to start my career after training in Louisiana, I realized that their National Guard had some very good programs as at the time as far as tuition reimbursement, and not even not even reimbursement so much as if you were in the National Guard, you maintained a certain grade point average. Essentially, you just had to prove service and that you were in good standing. You weren't barred and flagged through your National Guard unit. So I was able to qualify with a weapon. I was able to pass a PT test. And then also, I was maintaining a GPA at school that essentially was just verifying that. So I didn't have to pay money in. So now remember, on top of that, I had GI Bill at the time. And I think that I'd actually gotten an incentive based off of some things that were available when I signed up for active duty. So I had the $50,000 college fund at the time. And then towards the end of active duty, I had actually bought into an additional kicker. I had to pay in like $500 or something like that for an additional kicker. So I got that as well. So it set a situation where, and I don't know that it really exists that way anymore, but essentially it was like double dipping in a way, so that I was still getting my monthly allowance based off of the GI Bill benefits that I had earned. And then on top of that, because I'd become a Louisiana resident and I was going to school at a Louisiana state school, and I was meeting those other requirements. Essentially, I didn't have to pay money to the state to go to school, but I was still getting that income for the Guard. So I was able to live off that. So it made a lot of financial sense to be there and stay there. And then plus, I got accepted into a couple of schools in the state. I wasn't really sure I wanted to go to college, and I thought maybe I'd get a job in the trades. And then, I was urged to, give it a shot, use your benefits, try going to school. And then when I got into an undergrad program, I realized that I actually kind of liked it. And so it made sense to go ahead and finish getting a degree. And of course, it took a little bit longer than the standard 3 or 4 years because of deployments, both training deployments, also military education. You go away for a few weeks here or there to get training, and then also deployments that had occurred along the way, kind of post 9/11. So
that you bring up a great resource and a means how individuals, whether they do an active duty and then the Guard finds them, or they pursue the Guard, right? So what you described and utilize, you use your federal GI Bill benefit for your GI Bill benefits, right, that you earn from active duty. And then because you were in the Guard and you had the state benefit, you're allowed to use one state benefit and one federal benefit to pursue that education. And, we could call it double dipping and all that too. But it's all, it really sets an individual up well if they, know what state they want to be in and whatnot. And,
right.
Every state school has different relationships with the partnerships of the state. So that's really cool how you were able to access that and utilize that. And so talk a little bit about that, because it's like you skim the surface with, as far as like, okay, yeah, I'm in the Army Guard, Army National Guard through the state of Louisiana. You're setting yourself up to become a student and pursue a degree in higher education and set yourself up professionally, all while maintaining the professional standards of what it is to be a soldier. And especially, and what years were that? So what year did you get into the Guard?
Mid 2003, I separated from active duty. So I started my first semester of school that fall semester of 2003.
Wow. So right at the height of, well, not at the height, but the intense start of what we've been dealing with as a nation for the last 20 plus years. Right.
Yeah, it
So
was
that's when the Guard and the reserves.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of an interesting time. And so we can maybe dig into that a little bit more as well. So, you
Yeah.
know, I was still stationed at Fort Polk in 2nd Armored Cav when 9/11 had happened. And I want to say at that point, I think I already had, like, it was back in the days before really email in the military was even a big thing, at least for like junior service members, didn't really have it necessarily. Um, but we got like these, they call them a per status, basically from the personnel office, and like this little sealed kind of paper with the privacy and stuff on it, like you would get a check from a business for a payment, and is basically orders, or you're being notified that you're receiving orders to report to Korea. And it subsequently ended up being 2nd Infantry Division, and Area 1, like right along the border. So at that point, I was already pretty well locked in to where they weren't going to revoke orders for folks if their unit did get mobilized to go to Afghanistan at the time. And I think the unit I was in subsequently deployed or whatever, but I'd PCS'd, or basically permanent change of station as PCS, and transitioned to Korea. Did a little bit better than a year there, like 13 months or something like that on the border. And so I was pretty well locked in. And I think that I remember watching, like, being in the mess hall at our small little post up by the border, and watching like CNN and Fox News about preparations for, our invasion into Iraq, to liberate the Iraqi people. And so, I was pretty well locked into what I was doing at that point. And so then when I transitioned into the National Guard, I was going to school, but then I also started to think about, well, you know, of course, when you serve and there's a war going on, I think a lot of people want to be a part of it. I mean, war is hard and war is terrible or whatever, but if you're wearing the uniform and you know that you have brothers and sisters going over there, you want to get a piece of that at some point. So, even though we were still early into the war when I transitioned from the active duty to the National Guard, it was already a very different National Guard. And sure, there's the old kind of ribs from the active duty about, you're a weekend warrior and it's kind of lesser soldiers and whatever else, right? But I think that was just kind of, probably some of that was
guard bum playing wiffle ball.
Right. Well, I think some of that, is, there's probably some truth to it, right, at the time, because I think the National Guard, and it's not to diminish anyone's service, but the National Guard and Reserves as organizations pre 9/11 just didn't necessarily have an operational tempo at the time that was really conducive to making crack troops. And again, it's not a commentary on the people, because really, if you think about it, kind of post 9/11, you had Guard units that were being mobilized, going through train up, and then going overseas in the Army. A lot of those deployments were in the range of 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 months. So the Army is pretty notorious for long deployments. And the National Guard and Reserve in the Army component is, I mean, you're on that same program. So you now have a lot of people that are in the National Guard and Reserve who, maybe they're not quite up to the same standard when they're functioning as a citizen soldier, and they're kind of in between deployments and training and those types of things. But they go into those operational cycles where they're going through MOB station and they're going through their professional military education, that people are getting a lot more spun up. And you have Guard people that are a lot more tactically and technically proficient a lot of the time, just because of the op tempo. So when I got to a unit in the National Guard, Army National Guard unit, engineers, a lot of the guys that I met, I was just coming back from Korea. I was active duty, in great shape, wired pretty tight, really squared away. I've been Soldier of the Month and some other things like that. And I came to that Guard unit, and a lot of those fellas had just come back from one of the earliest deployments with like the 10th Mountain Division. So one of the first major conventional units that was in theater in Afghanistan, like they were a part of this. So there was really a good sense of that operational mindset, and, having an appreciation for, your tactical skill sets and capacity, and also strategic planning and all of those other things. And so I would say I had some growing pains at times because, I'd come from like sapper units and I was in second ID up on the border and stuff. So I was really wired tight for a long time operationally. So there was a little bit of kind of a learning period for me in adjusting, I guess, my volume a little bit to the National Guard. But eventually, that kind of came around and I got a sense for the different acronyms and different jargon, and also knew where I needed to tone some things down, particularly where we were like off a deployment cycle, so that I wasn't alienating other people within the unit, just trying to force my active duty mindset onto them. And I think it's there where I kind of learned to start to get an appreciation for just other organizations doing things different ways. And I would say that kind of transitioning from active duty now into the National Guard, it gave me a better perspective, and just willing to, or being able to function and take in information and listen a little bit better to how other organizations operate, whether it's in the private sector, whether it's multinational partners or different states, National Guard units and whatever. And so I really learned a lot. And so I would say that that was my first experiences in kind of developing skill sets to be a true like joint operator by going into the Guard.
That's awesome. Well, when did you get a sense? So in this transition, because it's one thing to transition from active duty to traditional civilian and figuring yourself where you're at in the civilian sector. It's a different degree of transition. I'm not saying, I use that tactfully. It's a different level of degree, more specifically of transitioning to the Guard and the reserves because of that dynamic. Because you have that active duty mindset, that experience, and there's a lot of value in that. But with the Guard, it's a different animal, it's a different beast. And when did you get a sense of getting an understanding of just how dynamic it is? And what I mean by that is the NCOs you were serving with, and who your supervisors were. Well, what civilian jobs did they have? Because I wasn't part of your unit, but I could speak to my unit a little bit. It's pretty dynamic as far as what they do in the civilian sector. And sometimes literally with the drop of a hat, they're making that transition within hours of answering the call of operational wise. So can you speak to that a little bit as far as like, you're like, why? Because for me, I was active duty as well. And when I was like, what? You're this? You're a police officer? You're a firefighter? You got your own private practice as a lawyer and a doctor. I mean, we could go down that list, but can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. So, I mean, a lot of this was over 20 years ago now for me, but I remember as best I can. So, it's kind of a decent cross. And I was in a line unit at the time, so I wasn't in battalion or brigade or division staff yet. So not so much of like in a engineer line unit. There weren't like doctors and lawyers or anything like that, but that would certainly come later in my career. But definitely you had a lot of folks, because we were engineers, that a lot of those folks did something similar on the civilian side, whether they were operating equipment, whether they were a carpenter, building trades, stuff like that. And then of course you had the folks that were in the police, maybe they were in the police force, they were sheriff's deputies, something like that. And then they were also in the National Guard. And there was actually pretty common, because again, most of the units I ended up getting into in the engineering side is basically two sides of the house. It's like real construction work, what you think of being construction and facilities type of work. And then the other side of it's combat engineering. And I think just a matter of early luck, and then probably subsequent placement based off of previous assignments after that, I just ended up into that combat engineering career track. So being in a combat arms units and a combat arms MOS is like I eventually classified as a combat engineer, bridge crew member, combat bridge crew member as well. And so a lot of folks with combat arms MOSs do end up being kind of in those police and first responder types of jobs. So I would say that was very similar. And then there were also, a lot of guys like me who were college age and who were going to school and then, navigating, getting to their weekend drills, or, if we had a 2-week annual training or 3 or 4 weeks, whatever. And so, I would say that because it was a line unit, not so much with doctors, lawyers, all of that stuff just yet. But again, that would come later in my career, particularly with some later experiences like the Army Reserve, where I was in senior staff roles and, I was a corporate executive and, there were other folks who, were running their own businesses. They were executives at Fortune 500s. You have, attorneys with private practice. Usually your JAG has a private practice, right? So that means just kind of a good cross section of folks, but coming together onto a shared common mission and, figuring out what that right operational language was to take all these people who are doing a lot of different stuff the other 28 days out of the month. And then also there's that component of understanding like local and regional culture, like, being in Louisiana as a kid from North Dakota. And when I first got to the unit there, my first drill in the Louisiana National Guard is a little different than being on active duty down in Fort Polk, where, it's in Louisiana, but it's basically active duty people from all over the country, right? Whereas in the Louisiana National Guard, it was more of those people were from Louisiana and had come up in Louisiana than other places. So when I first got there and I introduced myself or whatever, and someone's like, "Where are you from?" Because I obviously have a thick upper Midwestern accent. A lot of these guys are Louisiana boys with their Southern accents. And I said, "Well, I'm from North Dakota." Well, what the heck are you doing here? It's like, well, I'm trying to go to school and serve. And so we kind of have a good laugh over that. But, so yeah, I was in the Louisiana Guard as a North Dakota boy and did a couple semesters of school, and then pretty soon the world changed and, I ended up in a QRF and we got really busy really fast and ended up doing some, fairly frequent and even lengthy deployments with Louisiana Guard.
Tyler, I know we just experienced some technical difficulties, but we're back. That was really cool how you were talking about how, you went to Louisiana, the Guard unit. And what I'll say, it's a very home oriented, the Guard in particular is very local based, where individuals are from there and they live there their whole life. So, so when they get, for lack of better terms, like somebody from outside the state, an outsider, you get razzed a little bit, right? Like you were saying, like, yeah, you're from the Midwest and all that. So how long were you in the Louisiana Guard and where did that take you? And then if you could talk about a little bit how you leveraged that and how you identified that balance. It's like, all right, I'm going to make this work for me and then go on to do all these amazing things that you've went on to do.
So yeah, the Louisiana Guard ended up being a pretty formative experience. And to your point, yes, they do tend to be a little bit more homegrown. You can have folks that spend their entire career in the same unit. You usually get situations where you're going to have, brothers-in-law and brothers and sisters in the same unit. You get folks that are cousins and all of that other stuff. So when I first got there, coming from active duty and speaking with this accent that I speak with in a Louisiana unit, of course, it raised some eyebrows and like, well, what are you doing here? But the thing is, we still had a common baseline operational language, is that we were both part of the Army. However, we were in different components of the military area in the Army, and there were some differences there. But we were able to kind of find some common ground. And, I was able to kind of learn more about the National Guard. And eventually I found to where, even though, I didn't have the same accent as those guys that I was serving with, I was able to establish credibility with them as a competent leader and as a competent soldier. And we just kind of developed those relationships from there. And, I look back on it now, and Louisiana Guard really opened up a lot of doors for me in that, one, it gave me an appreciation for the different types of status that one can serve on. So, first and foremost in the Guard, you report to the governor of the state unless the governor relinquishes that control of you over to, the federal government for things like contingency deployments for Afghanistan. Iraq were the big ones at the time. So when I first got in Louisiana Guard, I did a couple of semesters of school, and I was drilling and I was going to annual training, and I ended up going to like my first NCO school and got that training and, all of those types of things. And then shortly, well, I want to say actually, I think before I even went to my first phase of my like E5 sergeant school, we'd gotten tasked with a quick reaction force for the state of Louisiana, basically. And to date myself a little bit, I got issued the government issued little pager beeper that if this goes off, you report to the unit and you get ready to deploy anywhere in the state for whatever contingencies. And where the National Guard's a little bit different than the Army Reserves or the active component is, National Guard isn't necessarily bound by the same like posse comitatus type of rules that exist for federal troops, meaning that governors can leverage National Guard units for things like humanitarian response, as well as like security functions and even policing functions, in a sense as being like deputized by the state to perform those functions. So in that sense, and that's one of those things I think a lot of our brothers and sisters that came from active duty really don't appreciate, that, although we're not training as intensely when we're not mobilized, and there's some things that, aren't quite as sharp in a drilling National Guard unit up until the point that they mobilize and get all their quals current, those types of things, is that there's a lot broader mission sets which in the National Guard that you can be tasked with. And again, for example, I ended up getting assigned to a quick reaction force for the state. That means basically if the governor picks up the bat phone and makes a call and says, I need a company size element to do these specific things at these specific locations on these specific dates, I was one of those lead units in the state that was part of that. So we actually got mobilized and deployed down to New Orleans to the Superdome during Hurricane Ivan the year prior to Hurricane Katrina, right? And so we went, we set up shop, we established intake. It was, called the shelter of last resort then as well. And Hurricane Ivan, I think it ended up going to the east, and it was, by and large a non-event for New Orleans. So it didn't make landfall near New Orleans. So I think we were there for 3 or 4 days, something like that, packed up, went back home, repacked our kit, and then, back to school, right? Well, the following year, then I was still part of this quick reaction force. And, I remember it to this day, it was probably 2, 3 in the morning or something like that. My beeper went off and they said, basically you go to the armory, you unlock your locker, you've got A bag and B bag with your rucksack and your duffel bag, and all that stuff's already packed, and it stays packed because you're part of a quick reaction force. So you're not messing around with shaving kits and all that other stuff. You have all of your stuff that's packed and ready to go. So you just get in your vehicle, you get to the unit, you get your orders, you organize your folks, and you roll out. So that's what ended up happening prior to landfall of Hurricane Katrina. And so we ended up getting deployed down to New Orleans. So my unit, company size element, I don't remember how many people. I don't think we were at full strength, but maybe 60 of us or something like that. And then there was another company within the battalion that was also on this QRF duty. So they got deployed down. I think we beat them by a little while, but so we ended up occupying the New Orleans Superdome again and started doing intake again for like shelter of last resort and taking people in and, maintaining security and perimeter and, helping folks who need medical and all this other stuff, humanitarian operation. And so I was at the New Orleans Superdome when Katrina hit and made landfall in New Orleans. And so we were batten down hatches in Louisiana or in the Superdome for that. And then obviously, I think everyone's familiar with the history of it now. Levees broke, the city flooded. There's a lot of mobility challenges. Telecoms went down. there was challenges with coordination between city government, between the state, between, the federal government getting involved in all those types of things. So, I was at the New Orleans Superdome for, from prior to landfall of Hurricane Katrina up until we'd evacuated everyone from the Superdome and eventually exfilled out there. I want to say that I think I was there for like 10 days. Our unit was there for like 10, 11 days or something like that. And by the time we'd pulled out and gone to a new admin area, kind of somewhere in the city, it was like a sports arena or something like that, where we ended up staying and running operations out of there for a bit. I was a little bit sick at that point, so I went to the medics. I think I had like a respiratory infection because, it's really rough conditions in the Superdome, and of course you're not eating as much as you should be eating. You're not drinking as much as you should be drinking because some of it just wasn't available, and it was hard getting resupply in and out. So, I mean, going for days without food and water, I think, if memory serves, I think I lost like 20, 25 pounds in just over a week.
Wow.
And then we continued to run operations throughout the city for like the next 5 months or something like that. And so, I mean, you have to put it in perspective now. 5 months isn't a super long deployment, particularly by Army standards, where they like to push those things out over a year once they get you there and keep you wherever you're at for a while. But you have to remember that, it went from having a beeper at the time going off, when most people maybe had a flip phone, and, you're deployed for 5 months on essentially no notice. So that's kind of what happened. And although it was in the same state, being in New Orleans post landfall of Katrina, it's like, you don't have fuel, you don't have electricity, you don't have food, you don't have water. You have a lot of people that are suffering in a rough situation. It's hard to get gear, equipment in and out of the city. So it's just kind of a surreal experience rather. And so, I was a 25-year-old guy at the time. And so I had a heavy squad of guys with me, and, 13 guys plus me. And so as a 25-year-old E5 sergeant and a junior leader at the time, that was pretty heavy, like sitting down and going like over like rules of engagement brief and, whatever missions we had going on, and really emphasizing to folks here just how dynamic of a situation that it was. Not so much in, well, I guess the best way to say it is like more complex in some ways than a combat operation, in that, yes, there was a risk level and there was some of that same austere operating environment. And there was, some instances of like people taking pot shots and stuff like that happens. But it's like, at the same time, it's like, remember, it's like, these are our people, these are our residents. And yes, there are some people that are kind of capitalizing on criminality, right, and taking advantage of the situation. But really, there was a lot of people that were just, struggling with the situation and trying to get by. So like, I even take some of those experiences, from being deployed, kind of tip of spear, New Orleans Superdome during Katrina with the Guard, which wasn't going to happen with any other units within the U.S. military because of posse comitatus. So you could say, we're going to pull this elite unit from here and put them in. That's not really how it works, because there's like constitutional legality that goes along with that. So it had to be National Guard units that went into that. So that's what I was talking about a little bit before, is that, I think that in some cases, we National Guard folks need to do a better job about telling our stories about really the diverse mission sets that we're dealing with, and the skill sets that citizen soldiers kind of bring to the U.S. military arsenal, and highlighting that. And so when I was at the Superdome and then operating throughout the city afterwards, it's when I got my first exposure to like private security and private military companies. Like, it's no secret that Blackwater deployed down there after Katrina, right? And was helping clients with recovering folks or securing facilities and making sure stuff didn't get looted. And there was, other companies that were doing those same things where, back in that day, you had the folks when the 511s were still cool. So they're down there with the 511 and the Polo and the M4. And then you have guys like me who are in a National Guard unit. We're rolling around in our Humvees and dump trucks or whatever. But I had an opportunity then to kind of work with some of those folks when we took up position. We were securing a hospital kind of on the outskirts of New Orleans after we'd pull it out of the Superdome. And so got a chance to kind of work with a couple private military contractors that were also contracted by that hospital to help secure. So it kind of became like a joint outpost between, I had a squad of guys, plus we had a couple of private military contractors there as well, where we were coordinating and we were sharing intelligence and, we were doing some operations like security and surveillance operations together and those types of things to keep the area safe. And then, eventually went on to another National Guard unit. But I guess I'll take a breath there, and because I don't want to dominate the whole conversation, man.
No, it's awesome. I love just hearing that story and your story and your journey. Because the Acknowledge to Action podcast represents just that. Like you acknowledge, going back to the genesis of your story. Okay, in high school you did the delayed enlistment, went on the Army active duty. You acknowledged that and you took action, and then you did that through the National Guard. And with those experiences you had, it led you to other opportunity that you may not have forecasted or anticipated. And I'm just curious. I say this as curious as one can be, because I got 24 plus years of military service to the Guard and whatnot. And some days I ask myself, is there really such thing as a balance? Striking a balance, navigating dual lives. My fun little, pretty little title, striking a balance, navigating dual lives in the Reserves and National Guard. I find myself like, okay, that's tough. And it takes a powerful, clear acknowledgement of that, to make that work. Because you mentioned retirement, right? So you did active duty, Guard, and then I heard reserves to go on to get at least a 20-year career. Is that accurate?
Yeah, just shy of 21 for reserve retirement.
Wow. And I could only imagine all this 4 years of that active duty, 17 years of that Guard reserve right now, with deployments, CO training. The Air Force would call it force development and whole airman concept, right? And every branch has their own way of describing that.
Total
but
soldier,
to do that,
total soldier concept in the Army.
Total soldier concept, and you don't get there's not an asterisk item because you're in the Guard or reserves. You still have to live up and maintain those standards on a part-time, 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks out of the year, or the general understanding. But it goes way above and beyond 1 weekend a year, 2 weeks out of the year, to manage that. And then to manage all your personal stuff, to go on. I know you said it took a little bit longer to get the college degree because of those responsibilities, but it was a means to an end, right? Whether it's financial and all that. So how would you credit yourself and also to share with others, like, hey, this is how I made it work. This is how I leveraged it. This is how I empowered myself to go do it.
So I cheated a little bit, right? Because, I know that there are Guard folks out there who, maybe they're an infantryman and they train that way 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks a year. Although in the Army, it seems like it's more a month-long annual training anymore. Maybe some of that started to compress back down a little bit again, since the op tempo is cooled a little bit. But I kind of cheated in that I didn't really ever view it as, okay, I need to go do my National Guard thing this weekend, or I'm going to go to annual training for a couple of weeks, or I'm going to go to a sergeant school, or, BNOC, ANOC, whatever, our NCO schools, and getting reclassified into different occupational specialties. For me, it was all more just a matter of, I considered myself to be a professional soldier and I did it for a living, and I had options where I did it. And so that's another cool kind of a best kept secret about National Guard membership or reserve membership is that you have some flexibility to do other closely related types of functions that are a lot like soldiering. And a lot of it kind of serves, whether it's internal defense or national defense strategy as a civilian. So you had people that were working on a full-time, like for full-time unit administrators for guard units. You had folks who were like mechanics at a National Guard shop that they did that full time and they just shifted status. So basically I did some of those same things, but then kind of turned the volume up to 11 on it. And that, okay, well, I'm a former active duty guy. I'm a National Guard guy. Now I've got some National Guard deployment experience with Katrina that's pretty well known and high operational intensity, and gathered some of those skill sets. And then, and I'd also had that bug then, we worked a little bit with private military contractors, and that's before like Blackwater got really big and some of those other companies were well known. So after Louisiana, I was finishing up school. I could finish the rest of my degree coursework online. This was still in a time where every course wasn't necessarily online, but I'd positioned it in a way that I'm old, right? But so I'd positioned it so I basically
I think you and I are the same age.
Well, yeah, I think joke. We're close in age. We're probably close to. We're old together, but it was back in a time when you had a flip phone, you carried a beeper to when your unit let you know you're getting deployed, and not every course could be taken online, right? It was absolutely a lot harder. So
it was still dial-up internet, probably, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I was at a point where the remaining classes I had through the school I went through for my undergrad in Louisiana, the remaining classes I needed to graduate were online. And so it's like, well, now I have this available to me. So maybe it's time I'm going to go back home, right? And, see some people, be around my family, stuff like that. So I ended up moving back to North Dakota, continuing on with my education through the state school that I was in Louisiana Guard. And some of the benefits coordination changed a little bit, but I had to deal with that, like being in the North Dakota Guard, going to Louisiana school. So there was a little bit of complexity there and administrative stuff. But basically, when I got up to the North Dakota Guard, I mean, you have to appreciate that I was pretty shortly off the heels of getting demobilized from Katrina, and just, so pretty rapidly back to back, I'd gone from active duty, spent a year on the Korean border at a pretty, high operational tempo. I mean, it was, no one was trading rounds, but I mean, it's a combat environment. It's an austere environment. And then I went to the Louisiana Guard, where beeper goes off, and it's kind of a life-changing experience being part of a QRF at the Superdome during Katrina. And then I transitioned up to North Dakota, and I integrated into a Guard unit up there, did a few drills, and I got a call, and it was from someone at like the state headquarters in Bismarck. And I don't even remember who it was, but they're like, are you Staff Sergeant Schmoker? I was a pretty young staff sergeant. I promoted pretty quickly. It's like, we're looking through our records, and it's like, you have these qualifications and these things. We think you might be a good fit for this joint mission that's coming up in Iraq. It's like, and they said the words, and I still remember, is that something you would be interested in considering? Very North Dakota nice about it. And I said, yeah, I'll go. and they said,
is that a question or a statement?
I mean, so it wasn't really like a voluntold scenario. I mean, it was more purely,
okay.
Hey, you fall into these criteria. This is something you consider. So it wasn't one of those where we strongly recommend you go. It wasn't one of those, because you have to remember, this was still pretty early in to the global war on terror. So you had a lot of people who were still trying to get a billet to go. And I'll tell you that when I was in Louisiana Guard, I was even actively trying to get onto a billet to go to Afghanistan or Iraq, because I'd been on active duty. I hadn't gone and supported GWOC directly in theater yet. And so I was looking for an opportunity to go overseas with a unit and deploy into a combat theater. Ended up doing Katrina, and then kind of was trying to get into other units, and I'm a little bit disappointed by this, but when I was in the Louisiana Guard, I was actually on a billet to go on a training mission to South America. I think it was Honduras, and I was really pumped up about that. We're going to go knock that out. It was like a month long or something like that, and operate down in South America in the jungle a bit. And then the unit that I was with, they decided, well, because I was asking, well, when are we leaving for this thing? They're like, yeah, we pulled you off the order. I'm like, well, why? And they said, well, because you're trying to get onto a deployment to Iraq, and if the unit calls up and you're in Honduras, it's like, I don't think it's going to move that fast. Can I please go? And they're like, no, we've already backfilled it. So that's one little regret that I have as far as timing, that I wanted to do some jungle ops with the National Guard. I ended up working in Latin America later, but so I was a little bit disappointed that I kind of don't have that billet where I went and operated in the jungle with an Army unit. But in any case, so I get up to North Dakota Guard. This guy asked me, would you consider thinking about going on this deployment to, CENTCOM AR, Iraq, Afghanistan, code for Iraq, Afghanistan? And I said, yeah, sure, I'll go. And he stopped and he's like, so you'll think about it? I said, no, I'll go.
And I thought about it, and here's my answer.
It's like, I'm doing some online schooling. I'm still pretty spun up and operationally sharp and in great shape. We come off New Orleans, and I'd come off, Korean border a little bit before that. So, I was a young stud at the time, and it's like, well, let's get on to the next thing and let's stay operational. And so that's the other thing too, is I think that a lot of people on the outside looking in don't really realize that, you have National Guard folks, they're going to stay with their unit. If they get the call, they're going to go, and then they're going to train or whatever. And that's perfectly fine. But then you also have some folks that are in the National Guard, and like the word guard bumming comes up, but you have folks that kind of make a good bit of their living off the National Guard and volunteering for stuff. So I was that guy. I mean, by the time I was probably 8 years into the National Guard, I'd finished like all of my military professional education to get promoted all the way up to the E8 level.
There it is, PME.
Yeah,
PME. I was looking for that earlier when we were talking professional. Yep. That's an industry standard for DoD.
So I was doing the PME, professional military education. Oh, we need someone to go to this thing, get on this, little state deployment for 2 weeks or 3. So I was rocking and rolling and networking and finding all these little ways to stay on billable time, whether I was doing training opportunities because the unit needed someone to go and represent it. Some of it was training I really wanted to go to. Some of it was stuff I was taking one for the team because the unit needed to send someone. And then, of course, you have deployments. So I was doing that, really kind of making a living off of being in the National Guard without being an AGR guy, because I was like the traditional M-Day soldier that was the 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year that did a lot more than that. So because of that, I was staying up on military standards, TTPs and things like that. So for all intents and purposes, I was operating in like a National Guard organization, but I would say at a level of intensity of like an active duty soldier. But I was just someone who had to do a lot of networking with different units and see what was going on and figure out the system so that I could get onto deployments, this, that, and the other. So I ended up doing that again with the North Dakota Guard, where they called me up and said, hey, we're going to do this thing. I'm like, okay, sounds good. I'll go. They were shocked. And then I said, well, when are we going? And they said, oh, it's going to be like, it was like months and months and months out. I said, I said this to him. I said, well, I'm going to tell you what, I'll be happy to do this with you, but my semester ends in a couple months. And based on when we're going, it's like, I'm going to have like 3 or 4 dead months where I can't get in another semester of school before we start mobilizing. So can you guys help me out? So they ended up getting me onto like some orders so that I was helping the unit I was with. We were doing supply stuff, moving equipment around or whatever, so that I didn't really have like a money gap because I wasn't going to be in school and I wasn't drawing that GI Bill for my income. So I was able to do that, and then ended up going overseas with North Dakota National Guard, did a tour in Iraq. We were attached to the Army Corps of Engineers, which was a really cool experience. So is the civilian side of the Corps of Engineers. So, those government employees who do stuff with the locks and dams, and they were involved with like the designing of the Panama Canal and all of this stuff. So I was essentially like a military liaison that was embedded into a civilian unit functioning overseas. So then I ended up developing local assets like local Iraqi engineers. So I would run those for like intelligence surveillance operations, making cash payments, doing those types of things. And then also, I was running operations and liaising stuff for the civilian, like trained professional engineers that were in those units. And I was doing reconnaissance and surveillance stuff myself and making sure projects were going well. And it was just a really good experience. And there too, the Corps of Engineers had contracted a couple of British paramilitary companies, so Aegis and Airneys at the time. So there were guys that were in these units that would support us with movement and intel. So I was coordinating with them regularly. And so a lot of these guys were like former British Royal Marines. You had former SAS guys, and then you had a smattering of former SEALs, and I don't know if there were any Delta guys, but for sure there were Special Forces Green Beret guys, and I can't remember if there are any like Air Force Special Operations folks or not. They're a little bit fewer and further in between, but so again, got that exposure like I had during Hurricane Katrina, where it's like there are these private military companies, and you have guys that are combat arms guys like me, or they were special operators, which I hadn't been, but they're getting these billets and they're doing these jobs. So that really got me thinking about, I've kind of been out here essentially doing some of that for myself. And it's like hyper networking within the National Guard to get onto deployments and find my next gig. Basically, I was military freelancing in a sense, and I was my own agent to keep myself busy. So when I got back from Iraq, kind of finished up going to school. By that point is 2008. The economy was a little crummy, especially, with the housing collapse, 2008, 2009. So if you're a young military guy like me with primarily a military resume, it's like, oh, I've got my bachelor's degree in psychology. Well, guess what? There aren't a lot of jobs. So it's not like I'm going to get into this, civilian career. So that's not really how it worked out for me. But it's like, well, I'm going to start putting together my resume and start getting smart on some of these different paramilitary companies. And I ended up getting onto a gig with a company that's since been acquired, but is kind of one of the first paramilitary companies in the US, a company called MPRI, or Military Professional Resources Inc. goes by MPRI. And eventually they got acquired and folded up, just like a lot of these other companies did kind of later on during the global war on terror. So I ended up getting onto a billet that was essentially built similar in composition to like Army Special Forces ODA. So you had specialists within areas of intelligence, reconnaissance. You had someone that was there for fires. You had someone that was there for command and staff, artillery, armor, and then engineering. So, and I think originally they were looking to hire like former Army Special Forces people within those MOSs. And because at that point it was already getting harder to find people. So the lore is, and I'm not 100% certain, but I think what happened was they allowed adjustments then. So maybe in place of a 18 series Army Special Forces engineer, it's like, well, we'll take E7s that have combat experience or X amount of months of combat experience plus this, that, and the other. So I made a rank requirement plus the MOSs I had plus the combat experience. So I essentially fell into that billet. And then so I got onto a contract. So of course, then there's more coordination with the National Guard. It's not like I could just take off for 10 months and not have them know where I'm at. So it's like, okay, guys, here's the deal. Here's where I'm looking at. So again, that's kind of a matter of being really deliberate with your career, but also being open and transparent about. So I went to my command and said, look, this is what I'm looking to do. It's on a task order for DOD. So I'm not just off doing some wild stuff. Like there was no question about the legality of it or anything like that. So I shared all the information with them and said, what can we do to make this work for us? And so in the case of that, the full-time staff of the National Guard unit that I was with was very accommodating as far as, okay, well, we have these things coming up that you can use drill days for this. So basically I was front loading like my weekend drills into like weeks at a time, right? Or annual training, like weeks at a time,
Oh, nice.
so
Yeah.
doing stuff that benefited the unit, but not missing out too much on like constructive time. And I eventually ended up, because I contracted for long enough, I did have some quote unquote bad years or time that was non-constructive because I wasn't actively drilling. I mean, it was excused, so I was in good standing, but I wasn't doing those active drills at a certain point to where I was getting retirement credit for it. And so for that reason is why I ended up having to extend closer to 21 years to get all of my good credit and make up for that missed time where I wasn't meeting the minimum requirements. So I ended up contracting for a while as a paramilitary, which got me kind of smart and connected with the corporate security industry. And I ended up eventually working for large corporate security firms and supporting Fortune 500 clients, all the while being in the National Guard and then eventually the reserves. So it's one of those things where, yes, there were times that I was absent from like training schedules and those types of things. But the commands that I worked with, one, I was always forthright with information. It's like, here's what I do for a living. Here's what it looks like. Here's what you can expect from me as far as like monthly check-ins or whatever else like that. And, if I need to come back to do something with you all, you have to give me a little bit of lead time because I have to figure out like commercial air out of Afghanistan, for example, is a case of that. So it's like, don't ask for me to come into the unit tomorrow because I'm actively in Afghanistan and it takes time to get out of the country, especially if you can't rely on military air. So there were kind of those coordinations as well. But I think all of that collective experience of being a National Guard soldier and eventually a reserve soldier, but basically soldiering all of these other different ways supporting the US government and different governmental organizations outside of DoD, it really helped me to learn how to kind of hyper network and make sure that I always had that next billet to go on. And I was also doing a lot of research to where I was able to get on interesting billets. So, I've had the opportunity to do different, training opportunities with like the US State Department and stuff with Department of Energy and like nuclear reactor defense and a lot of these other things that a lot of National Guard guys don't get, but it's because I was proactive about it and I found these programs to get on to. And I also maintain clear communications with the National Guard and Reserve units that I was with so that they allowed me to do these things. And they also saw that, yeah, maybe they were getting me 2 weekends a month, or maybe in some cases it was like I was doing 3 weeks of drill, but they knew that I was out doing the work. So if they needed to deploy, I was pretty sharp, right? So it's things that benefited the unit. And at the same time, there's things that I brought back to the unit as well. It's like, okay, so I've got experience now with like high-speed convoy and advanced motorcade and blocking techniques and pit maneuvers and all this other tradecraft stuff that a lot of National Guard folks don't get. But then you can start to share some of those training opportunities with your unit as well as it pertains to mission, as long as there weren't like classifications or restrictions with some of that stuff.
That's awesome. As I'm hearing all this, I know the focus was balancing lives, balancing a National Guard Reserve career to civilian life, right? But also, too, because one of the feature topics I want to have in a future episode, but it's already highlighted in this episode, is the power of networking and the significance of networking. Because I think the Guard and Reserves gives you this amazing access point. I'll say that, access point to identify and acknowledge, and meet yourself where you're at, in young 20s, there's a lot going on, right? Trying to figure things out. But as you leverage that, as you figure that out and you leverage it and you start getting a good line of sight as far as what you do next, man, you could really do a lot. It takes work though. It takes effort. It takes all these different things that come with achievement and challenging ourselves and whatnot. It's far from easy because, I'm thinking about what you said about, in North Dakota, the acknowledge to action process mindset is, acknowledge, accept, process, plan, action. That was like a pretty heavy duty life decision you made within seconds of moments. Like, yeah, you acknowledge it, you accepted it, you process, planned, action, you took action, and the rest is history. But like I was saying jokingly last time, like you could use acknowledge to action to what you want to do for dinner. That's a quick sequence of events. Whereas you did that for like Iraq, yeah, acknowledge, yep, I'll do it. Boom, when are we going? And it can be that expedited when it comes to significant life decisions, and I believe, and I'm speaking from experience, hearing your experience, that happens all the time in the Guard and the reserves, and a lot of times we don't hear it because it's not the coolest story in the room right off the bat, right? Because it's like, oh, they're just going back to being a school teacher or going back to so many fill in the blanks, right?
There's a lot of flexibility.
It's really cool to hear that because
there's a lot of flexibility to make it cool, though.
Yeah. And then you took that power, like, so early on, you embrace that power of networking. You identify, like, all right, this is what I have to do to build myself up. And it was a combination of opportunity, people identifying some skill sets in you and strengths, but then you like taking that to the next level. And then because we could I'm going to have you back on because there's a whole nother dynamic and as far as what you're doing on, what you done on LinkedIn and, your own business, Winsley, where you're the founder and principal at Winsley, and that all stems from being a high school senior going on to be, hey, I'm general, I'm just, because it's kind of like how I see my life too, being a high school, I did the delayed enlistment and all that, and then you go on to acknowledge those things, whether, nobody, I know I was 20. I acknowledge that this is an opportunity for me and I'm going to proceed. Right. In hindsight, we look back on it and it's like, it's pretty empowering and amazing when you're in the moment where you're able to do that, or it plants the seed where those things come to fruition. And like I said, we didn't even talk about how you're an endurance athlete, how you're a LinkedIn disruptor, and that's a good thing, folks. If you're not a LinkedIn thing, that's a really awesome thing.
It probably depends. It probably depends who you ask, right? Some people might.
I like that sort of.
Yeah, some people say yes, some people say no.
True. Yeah, for me, I think that's pretty exciting. It shows who highlights who you are and that energy and all that stuff, and that's what this is all about. Just like the military as a whole is arguably one of the most diverse microcosm populations that we have in the United States, right?
Yep.
And then you take that to another dynamic to where the Guard and Reserves and how it speaks to all the diversity. And what people bring to the table. And I think that's what makes, I'll say, whether it's Army, Air Force, Guard, Reserves, it's what makes us so special and how we come together and how we're able to leverage those differences and those dynamic backgrounds to come together objectively and go meet that mission. And I know we're in an era of a lot of uncertainty and numbers are hurting, but I believe and I trust in our young generation to kind of meet that call, and that's there. But through hearing stories like this and just kind of reflect on what they want to do and empowering themselves and acknowledging what they want to do, and we put some tools in their toolbox so they can figure out how to do it, right? And so that I just kind of wanted to kind of highlight as I'm hearing all this and we could go on and on, man. This is awesome because I have a feeling we could go down some really cool rabbit holes as far as to some of the things you talked about here today. But
the biggest thing is
what do you have to say? So
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead. No,
I was just going to say one
I have
of
a
the
feeling you're going to say what I was thinking.
One of the biggest things I think it's incumbent upon folks like you and I, Matthew, and others who are deep into our careers to kind of highlight and tell those stories, right? Because that's how we're going to get these Zoomers who are coming up interested in joining the military. And, maybe they're going to go off and go active duty. Maybe they want to try and get a special operations contract. Maybe they want to get into that career field in the military that directly translates to a civilian career where they get out, they have a job right away. So there are just a lot of different avenues. I think one of the main things is just kind of highlighting those stories from a National Guard and Reserve perspective, because again, there are just a lot of different ways to do it. There's a way to serve your country, serve your community in a way that's, a weekend a month, and it's 2 weeks a year, and you run your small business or you work for your long-time job that's not that. And if you get called to deploy, you prepare your family, you go do it, you come back and do that. And that's perfectly noble and admirable. Mm-hmm. And then there's also kind of those extreme cases like, maybe I'm the kid who should have never got off of active duty and just got re-enlisted and gone to school, but I didn't do it that way. But then as soon as I did it, I'm like, I'm onto something really unique here, and it gives me a lot of flexibility to kind of paint a different picture and tell a cool story afterwards. So, but again, to your point, it takes a lot of being proactive, because if I wasn't proactive, I'd find myself where I wasn't getting on to the next operation. And then I was going to have money problems or all these other things. And then maybe I just get a job, and then maybe, my professional soldiering days are over until we get called up to go to Iraq once every 3 years or something like that. So you have to be proactive with it. And then also knowing that there are going to be those situations where you're in uncharted territory. I mean, I can tell you that when I went off to be a paramilitary as a 28, 29-year-old, National Guard guy, there weren't a lot of people I knew that were doing what I was doing, right? I mean, it was mostly retired people, and a lot of people that had gone from active duty were on these contracts, and, they were getting their retirement. And so there's very few people that walking around Afghanistan that had a DOD contractor ID card and a National Guard ID card in my pocket at the same time. So it's just kind of a unique situation. But yeah, I mean, just tell those stories. And then again, like as far as like this, you talked about the speed of my acknowledge to action. The best piece of advice that I would leave for people listening to this who are maybe in the Guard or Reserve in particular, or, wanting to consider how they can kind of take an unconventional path to do it full time. I mean, no one's story is going to be exactly the same, but the reason that I was able to quickly make decisions about, as an opportunity came up, like, hey, would you think about considering going to Iraq? Yeah, sure, I'll go. But here's the thing. It wasn't like I was making an impulsive decision like when I went to contract. Like I was weighing the pros and cons and what it would mean for my career and all these other things. But the main thing was I had already set my mission parameters beforehand. So I knew what things I wanted to do and what boxes I wanted to check as something that came up. So when those things came up, I knew what they were because I'd already gone through that process. I knew I wanted to get on a deployment. I knew I wanted to do this. I knew how much.
You were absolutely prepared for it.
So when it happened, you
were absolutely prepared for it. So it was a no-brainer. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that was a
no-brainer, but it was a very tactful, expedited thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So when the opportunity knocked and it was the right knock, you didn't have to hesitate. And so then for those reasons, I was able to progress my military career in some cases faster, and also my civilian career faster in terms of getting schools, getting rank, getting experience, and even getting like paramilitary experience that still's on some of my NCOERs, right? So because there was enough of a correlation, they're like, well, yeah, this guy was over contracting or whatever, and maybe he didn't have it. He had an unrated period for a year, but yeah, I was in Afghanistan working. Here's my paperwork. So when I go up on a senior enlisted board, no one's beating me up saying, well, hey, where were you at for a year? Well, I was in Afghanistan and it's right there. Oh, okay. That makes sense. All right, carry on. And so it's not like I was someone who took off for 12 months and wasn't around being a dirtbag. I mean, I was in theater. I was getting paid by a different color of money through the US government at the time. And then I bring those skill sets back and then do stuff with the unit, right?
That's awesome. That's a great way of putting it. So being almost, what word comes to mind is like be curious and challenge yourself and be open to those challenges. And I read a book about a year ago that just was like a game changer for me, and it was by Michael Easter and the Comfort Crisis. And it just really, the essence of that book was like, be comfortable being uncomfortable, meaning living up to the challenges and allowing yourself to take advantage of the opportunities when they come their way. So yeah, I just had to share that because that's what's coming to mind as I'm processing everything you're saying today, because it's such a great message and an amazing message, because you nailed it. I mean, I'm not going to reread the question, but like you gave some amazing insight and advice as far as like, wherever you are on your journey, right? That's kind of like my shtick here. Wherever you are on your journey, you're not alone, but there's a lot of resources out there to help you figure it out, to help you acknowledge where you're at and identify those guidance and that empowering sort of information you need to press forward. And it's not easy. I mean, it's through, conversations like this. It's through insightful sort of reflection. It's through somebody just getting in your face and saying, yo, like, you got to get it together. You know what I mean? Manage your life or it's going to manage you, sort of thing.
That's exactly right, Matthew. It's manage your life or it'll manage you. So, and, but yeah, and we're connected on LinkedIn. So you notice that I use the same tagline pretty much every time I close out a post. It's just 2 words: stay capable. Right. And so I live by a mantra of stay capable, so that I know that if my shot group is tight, I'm keeping my skill sets sharp. I'm keeping my search sharp. I'm keeping my fitness sharp. And I'm also focused on what my next moves are going to be ideally. And, they present themselves how they present themselves, but you need to kind of understand if it's like a no-go, like a no-go situation for you, because, maybe things present themselves, but it takes you down a path that's not really conducive of your mission. Right. So there are some things that you'll have to say no to and pass on, but I always use the term stay capable, because if you're capable, you don't ever have that point of hesitation about, well, there's a school coming up, but I'm not in great shape now. So come back to me in 3 months and maybe I'll get into my next promotion course. Then it's like, yeah, but if you're already sharp and if you're already fit and you're already spun up, and someone says, hey, we've got this thing, would you consider it because someone else just dropped out and we need to fill the slot? I was always the guy that's good to go. Let's go right now. And that's why I was an E7 in like 9 years, because I was the guy who said, yeah, good to go. Let's go right now. If it fits into my mission criteria and what I'm doing next, and you're giving me the opportunity now, I don't have to worry about getting in shape. I don't have to worry about getting gear, all this other stuff. I'm ready to go. And for me, that ended up being even a decisive career advantage over my peer group and my cohort as we were coming up through the ranks, because I was the guy that was able to say yes a lot just by my life situation and my level of preparedness. So for folks that are listening, stay capable to the things that align with your mission set and your professional strategy, so that when opportunity knocks on those things, you don't even have to hesitate on saying, good to go. This is the right opportunity for me. I'm going to do it right now. And guess what? If you're the person that's able to do those things, the guy or girl, the soldier, the airman, the sailor, the Marine that's able to do those things, you start to establish a reputation within your service, within your unit, and within that professional community, that you're a person that doesn't need a whole lot of nudging to get stuff done, and you become an asset. And once you become an asset because you're a frictionless resource that can help the organization, those opportunities start getting channeled to you, and they don't even ask other people. So you have first right of refusal. Hey, we got this cool school coming up, Sergeant Schmoker. You want to go? Yep, good to go. Let's go. When we leaving? Bags are packed.
That's an immediate acknowledge to action, because you've already did the processing and the planning already ahead of time. You're like, you take action on it. That's awesome. That's an awesome way to kind of like, I think, tie things up, because I want to share. I've referenced this in every episode so far, so it's become a reoccurring thing. So my new MEPS is, MEPS for all of us. Some of it is good, some of it is bad, some of it is a little bit. For me, it was just it was what it was. I got what I asked for, right? But my new MEPS speak to what you're saying, to take care of yourself and prepare yourself and all that, is mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual. Now, Brilliant. I got to give a shout out to Greg Van Dyne, because he was on the previous episode, and it's MEPS with 2 S's. He said social. I'm like, yeah, you're so right.
Brilliant.
So, mental, emotional, physical, social, and spiritual. So when you take care of that and you make that your foundation, man, like you said, you're going to have to turn down opportunity across the board in all aspects of life. And that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Like, well, what does it mean to be mentally? I mean, we could go down that list as far as some objective ways to do that, but that's what this really represents. And it's been awesome to have you on here, Tyler. It really has, man. Like we could go on and on. And I liked the invite is always for you here. Cause I mean, this is awesome. We talked about balancing dual lives. We talked about networking, and we talked about wellness. I mean, we really covered a lot today, and I appreciate this, and I look forward to our continued evolving relationship through LinkedIn and through networking and all that. Yeah, so I can't thank you enough, and I sent out a heads up beforehand, but as the guests and the interviews grow, so does our playlist. So I think we have a pretty kick-ass start off to the Acknowledge to Action playlist that's accessible on Spotify. I'm listening to it on the regular now. I'm not, and so I'm really pushing out there. But what song do you want to dedicate to the playlist?
I think Country Boy Can't Survive probably best sums it up for me. It's like you take the kid off the farm. You can't take the farm out of the kid. And I managed to work hard and figure it out. Even if I didn't necessarily always fit in, I found a way to make it work and, get to know people and contribute as best as I could with, whatever limited talent I had at any particular time. So Country Boy Can't Survive.
That's awesome. I can't wait to add that to the list. I can't thank you enough. This has been really awesome, Tyler. I appreciate your time. I appreciate you sharing your journey, and how it's gonna, to all of our listeners, how it's gonna help them really add some tools in their toolbox to wherever they're at. So, yeah. Man,
thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be a resource and hopefully people find some value in it. And again, Matthew, thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be on the show.
I appreciate that. And I'll get your contact information out. It'll all be accessible on the YouTube channel and all that, where they could find you. And people are curious to see what a disruptor is all about. Look up Tyler and get some further great guidance and all the other great stuff that, I mean, we didn't even get a chance to highlight, but I think we're off to a good start. I know
I'll come on and run my mouth. Yeah, I'll come on and run my mouth again anytime, Matthew. Whenever you're ready to have me again.
All right, Tyler. Hey, until next time, man.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Big thank you to Tyler for sharing his journey with us. As we wrap up this episode, it's crucial to recognize the myriad stories and career paths within the military that often go unnoticed. Each individual, regardless of their role, contributes to the rich tapestry of our community, and it's essential to shine a light on their experiences. The National Guard and Reserve offer a vast array of career opportunities, from humanitarian missions to specialized skill sets that enrich the military landscape. Tyler's journey during Hurricane Katrina exemplifies the dynamic nature of the Guard, showcasing its adaptability and diverse contributions. Navigating dual lives can be a challenge, but it's clear that being proactive and staying capable are key to seizing opportunities aligned with your mission. Building networks and remaining open to new challenges are vital aspects of this journey. Moreover, it's important to recognize the unique position of the National Guard, which isn't bound by the same rules as federal troops. This flexibility presents both opportunities and responsibilities, requiring individuals to maintain standards even on a part-time basis. In closing, let's continue to highlight the stories of those in non-traditional military paths, acknowledging their contributions and embracing the diverse opportunities and flexibility offered by the National Guard and Reserves. Thank you for joining us. And until next time, stay proactive, stay capable, and keep striving towards your goals. Thank you again to Tyler for sharing his journey with Acknowledge to Action. I eagerly anticipate staying connected and engaged with you through the Acknowledge to Action podcast and beyond. And as always, remember to embrace the journey. With Acknowledge to Action, wherever you are on your journey, you are not alone. Until next time.